We want to believe. Introductory quote. Objectively, it is we who have all the correctness and strength, and the process is favorable to us. The world crisis of Stalinism is growing. The colonial revolution intensifies. The Latin American sections develop. In Cuba, we have the clearest and most conscious optimism that we will overcome the present situation, and that in a few years we will be at the head of the socialist revolution. The Internationale mounts an invincible force. By J. Posadas, 1961. Beginning of another quote. If optimism was rocket fuel, this party could have flown to the next galaxy. Which isn't too good a joke, since most of our comrades on the left thought that was where we came from. End of quote. From Dave Douglas of the Revolutionary Workers' Party, Trotskyists, British section of the 4th International Posadist. Section. Part 2. The Posadist 4th International. 6. The Flying International. I've decided, Posadist cryptically remarked as he strolled through St. Peter's Basilica with his tour guide, an Italian Trotskyist named Mario. Decided what? Mario asked. Posadist replied they would discuss it later. It was the last days of 1960. January's Sixth World Congress was rapidly approaching, the stage set for a dramatic realignment of the International in Pablo's absence. A functionary of the Italian Secretary, Livio Maitan, Mario hoped to get a sense of what Posadist and the Pabloites were preparing. Even prior to Pablo's arrest, Maitan noticed the behavior of Posadist's BLA had grown increasingly strange. Since October, he wrote, their press began to publish extreme screeds in Posadist's unmistakable, quote, erratic style, including a call for tightening discipline within the organization, mandatory integration of wives and girlfriends as militants, claims that it was they who influenced Castro's leftward turn, and other implications that Posadist was, quote, mystically invested with a mission to regenerate Trotskyism, end quote. For the moment, however, Posadist only seemed interested in the ruins. At the Roman Forum, he studied Trajan's Column, a towering frieze of marble depicting a materialist history of imperial plunder. On a centuries-long walk to the Vatican, they discussed details of the fallen empire through the Renaissance. But Louis, Mario said, you can't really be interested in this. What do you really want to know? Anything about the meeting we're about to have? End quote. It was only when Posadist was face-to-face with Michelangelo's Pietà, a depiction of Christ post-crucifixion collapsed into the lap of Mary, that he came up with an answer. As Mario reluctantly gave his standard tourist spiel about the artistic harmony of the marble figures, Posadist noticed Mary's hand, damaged like his own, in a work accident when a mover dropped the statue in the 16th century. History was not yet ready for such perfection then, but, feeling the moment coming close, Posadist picked up his chisel. The Sixth World Congress was held in a youth hostel near the German-Swiss border in early January. At a preparatory gathering on New Year's Eve, some of the 100 delegates from 30 countries gathered to celebrate the turn of the year, many optimistic that the deep scar of the 1953 split was slowly healing. Shortly after midnight, Maitan recalled, Posadist stood up, waving, and all the Latin Americans went to bed even though the party continued. The rest of the Congress was darkened by similar ominous gestures by the BLA. Over 9 days, the BLA representatives sat and argued as a bloc. Quote, their interventions were all sharply critical, Maitan wrote. Even when they had no counterproposal, every presentation turned into a furious debate, leading up to a final showdown on the question of international leadership. Quote, what we need today is to discuss and enrich our collective Trotskyist thought on forms of organization of the international in order to respond to the new demands made by a new phase in world revolution, open in the 60s, Gilly began. Cuba demonstrated a new level of anti-colonial struggle not previously known. A similar process was underway throughout Latin America, largely in isolation from the Eurocentric Fourth International. Only through the anti-colonial revolutionary process spreading through Africa and Asia would the, quote, problem of the workers' movement in the advanced capitalist countries be addressed. He concluded the International should adapt to the process practically by continuing Pablo's strategy of direct support for colonial revolutions wherever they arose, and politically, by immediately reorganizing the international leadership to have a non-European majority. One can imagine the quantity of groans, aggressive scribbling of rebuttals, and slapping of palms against delegates' foreheads as Gilly revealed the proposal. They interpreted the concept in two ways. One was that the BLA proposed a, quote, flying international, in which militants would be untethered from their roots in their national workers' movements, sending cadres to hotspots of world revolution, in the same way Pablo supported the FLN. The BLA denied this at the time, but later published an essay endorsing it. The second interpretation was a naked power grab, with Pablo in prison and the Pabloite majority of the IS in the balance. A BLA majority would move international headquarters to Montevideo, with Posadas as its new secretary. Few, if anyone, supported the idea. In subsequent documents debating the Lucero-Gilly-Maitan affair, those who agreed with the principle of a non-European majority were disturbed by the aggressiveness of the play. The Indonesian delegate Ibnu Parna characterized the BLA as, quote, acting like children. Even other Pabloites saw Posadas as a vulgar caricature of their leader's most divisive instincts. As Frank wrote in his History of the Fourth International, beginning of long quote, the arrests of Pablo gave Posadas the opportunity to launch a violent faction fight against the majority of the members of the international leadership. He mobilized all his forces in Latin America to obtain a majority at the Congress. He pretended to be Pablo's spokesperson, and it was at this time that his positions and his statements began to become more and more extravagant. So extreme was his behavior at the Congress that a small group of comrades, forerunners of the Pablo tendency, disassociated themselves from Posadas despite sympathy for his positions. End quote. In his History of French Trotskyism, Les Trotskistes, Christophe Nick wrote that Gilbert Marquis, Pablo's surrogate, quote, would have been well tempted by an adventure to the south, but to offer the Fourth International into the hands of Posadas seemed to him the ultimate folly. The debate was settled with an agreement for a new secretariat, with 4 European and 5 non-European members, 3 of them from the BLA. The latter group, however, included 2 Asian delegates who would not be able to stay in Europe. As a result, the triumvirate of Maitan, Frank, and Mandel retained their majority. Livio Maitan became acting secretary, and the International's headquarters were moved to Rome. Back in South America, Posadas convened an emergency congress of the Latin American sections to offer his account of the defeat. Despite all the BLA had achieved, the Europeans still preferred to unify with the dissident British and North American sections than be led by their colonial subjects. The BLA Congress approved his text, The Current Stage of the Crisis of the Growth of the International, and sent it to the entire International in September. For years, the text submitted under the name Posadas contained some overexuberant claims, but were always written or carefully edited by the movement's intellectuals. In internal documents, there was a clear difference when referring to Louis or Luigi, the man today known and here referred to as Posadas, and the collective, spiritual Posadas, to whom Louis always referred in the third person. For many, this was the first time reading the unedited voice of Louis, now speaking through the Posadas pen name with unrestrained fury. More personal screed than polemic, he complained that while the BLA was influencing Castro, Guevara, and even Mao, the Europeans had, quote, lost their spirit, softening to become a, quote, polite labor movement that sabotaged colonial revolution through inept paternalism and perverted the entire International through personal degeneracy. Quote, after the Sixth World Congress, the crisis in the direction of the International worsened sharply. There are no real European sections. They have no party life and only small spots of public activity. And in Germany and Belgium, and partly in Austria, there are practically no parties or outside Trotskyist agitation. In Belgium, Germain Mandel directs a group of what remains of the section that is dedicated to preparing his parliamentary career. End quote. The worst invective was saved for Sherry Mangan, recently deceased in Rome after a heart attack, who had invited Posadas into the International's fold 20 years prior. Quote, "We declare that he was a man who rendered very, very little service to the Latin American Trotskyist movement. His behavior was that of a bourgeois with some revolutionary ideas, but who lived a bourgeois life in all senses. A womanizer, a boozer, who died because of his life as a womanizer and a boozer." End quote. He closed the letter just short of announcing their split, a threat that shockingly also attacked Pablo. Quote, "For the past 2 years, the Latin Americans and the BLA have been demonstrating the strength of the international community. We have dozens and dozens of contacts, relationships, and colonial movements with whom we must be able to relate. We have to bond with colonial revolutions in other parts of the world. That is why they all despise the BLA. Our duty is to work in such a way as to win, if possible, all the comrades so that they can develop their experiences and clearly understand and accept the Latin American sections and the BLA, without prejudices and without paternalism. We have constructed structures difficult as this one. We are able to influence the comrades of Europe, and among them Comrade Paulo, which we want and hope to influence to make him change his pettiness, resentful attitudes, and crimes against the International." End quote. An IS Control Commission fired back with a desperate letter to the Latin American sections, answering, in Spanish, the, quote, "disfigured and odious" claims of Posadas. "We send a call of alarm," they wrote, "that the BLA were preparing, quote, a rupture of not only some members of the international leadership, but also of the International itself." The BLA was not, in fact, larger than the European Bureau. They had always published BLA texts, sent them financial support, and had never once referred to Latin Americans as, quote, Indian savages. The letter was especially indignant about the slurs against, quote, "the memory of our comrade Patricio Mangan, dead in his field of work," end quote, which they refused to dignify with a response. Despite believing the BLA had become a, quote, centralized apparatus, anti-democratic, without a clear political line, they invited them to participate in the next Congress, promising it would have 5 Europeans, Pablo, Santen, Meitan, Mandel, and Frank, and 6 non-Europeans, Posadas and Sendik, plus delegates from Bolivia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. The fact that the Indonesian and Sri Lankan delegation tended to vote with Europeans, they said, demonstrated that the BLA's maneuver was motivated by a sectarian attempt to avoid politics, rather than genuine anti-colonial principle. The offer for reconciliation was an attempt to reveal the BLA as abusing the democratic process for their own ends, something Posadas all but confirmed when he called for an, quote, extraordinary Congress of the Fourth International, under the direction of the BLA in Montevideo for April of 1962. Over the course of 9 days, the Fourth International was completely reorganized, with a new executive committee headed by Posadas, his wife Candida, Sierra, Sendik, Gilli, and Minazzoli. The Belgian, French, and Italian sections, who were not invited to the Congress, were expelled. Gilli traveled to Rome to personally deliver the resolution to Meitan at his apartment. Meitan's then functionary, Piero Leone, recalled the scene. Quote, "Meitan ripped up those sheets, and, after an exchange of insults, which almost came to blows, we left. The thing was quite theatrical, but also a bit grotesque." End quote. The IS responded in kind in June. The BLA and all its participants were suspended. Only Pablo dissented. Despite Posadas' transgressions, he said the triumvirate neglected to understand the, quote, crucial role of the Latin American countries in the World Revolution, a position that portended poorly for the Fourth International in colonial and semi-colonial countries the world over. His criticism was ignored. Pablo was blamed for creating the monstrous Posadas, a crime justifying the expulsion of him and all of his disciples. The Pabloite youth group was closed and reopened to refresh its membership. militants who came to appeal to Pierre Frank in person received a handwritten letter coldly announcing their summary expulsion. By the time he emerged from prison, Pablo found himself sidelined from power in the International, which he helped rebuild. While much of the BLA Corps hoped the Pablo faction would join their side to reconstitute the European Bureau, Posadas' closing speech at the Extraordinary Conference made it clear there was no room for, quote, old Trotskyists. Meitan, Frank, Pablo, and all the other European sections, parties, and groups were permanently expelled. Within only a few years, Posadas also abandoned many of the central resolutions of the historical Fourth International to proclaim a new stage of Marxism-Leninism-Trotskyism centered specifically around him, the Fourth International Posadist. That most Trotskyists doubted the logic of splitting a movement already struggling to regain its footing made no difference. Since Trotsky's assassination, the decapitated party suffered the same crisis as the global proletariat, a lack of leadership. Posadas saw Trotsky's International less as a communist mass movement of parties, union factions, cadres, and individuals than a centralized team, an intellectual nucleus concentrating the activity and growth of the righteous rage and destructive forces of the broader proletariat into a tiny vanguard. If used at the right time and in the right way, it could be a powerful weapon. Posadas was convinced that it was he who was destined to pull that weapon from the Coyoacan rock where Trotsky was buried, by splitting it open. End of section.